You can't argue with nature. Well, you can try, but it's pretty futile. And this vlog is going to be about that and how that applies to some of our Qigong practice and the principles behind our Qigong practices. So I was having a conversation with one of the students who's recently completed one of the Long White Cloud Qigong courses. Specifically, he'd actually just finished the Elemental Alchemy program, where we teach a whole range of different practices. I won't get into too much all the different practices that we teach, but one of the practices included in one of the sets there is a shaking practice. And there's a whole lot of variations of how you can do the shaking practice, and it's really beneficial. Very simple to do, but a whole lot of benefits that come from it. And even though he'd just finished the course, he already is familiar with a whole range of other Qigong practices and already teaching. And so he had started to teach some of those practices within some of the classes with some of the groups and individuals that he worked with. And he was saying how he struggled with this particular one. Not that it was difficult for him to do himself, and it wasn't difficult for the people to attend his classes to do either. But just he was like worried that they'd think it was a bit too weird, or not really understand what it was about, or things like that. And so we had a little bit of a talk about this, and one of the things I talked about was, hey, look, the shaking practice, there's all these different benefits, and we can see this in nature as well. And a really good example of this is dogs. And because we see, dogs often shake very vigorously. And they do this for a range of reasons, classic one, sometimes if they're wet, and they shake very vigorously just to dry themselves off. That's not why we do it in this particular Qigong practice. But they also often shake in other situations as a way of regulating their nervous system. And so we've got this very clear example from nature, from another type of animal in nature. It's like, that's why they do this. It's a really clear example. They do it in a really obvious way. And that's some of the benefits that we get from doing this too. And with that perspective on things, he was able to think like, oh yeah, actually, that's okay. I can explain this to the people that I work with, and yeah, they'll get that. And even though it might seem a little bit weird to begin with, to do this shaking, yeah, that understanding it from another context in nature will help them to understand how it's beneficial for them too. Great, cool. And this principle we see throughout Qigong practices, because Qigong is very much, it's working with nature, it's working with our nature, it's working with the environment around us, and so on. And because of that, many of the Qigong practices draw directly from things we see in nature around us. So not just from focusing on ourselves, but from learning about the patterns we see in nature, the things we see in nature, and then how that applies to us. And that's a beautiful principle, I think, because it really gives us this context to understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and again, it becomes very hard to argue against when you understand it in the context of nature. A lot of people, I guess, because Qigong, we work with things that are maybe outside of what they normally focus on. Not unnatural, not supernatural, but just not what they normally focus on. Things like being aware of our energy, and moving it in specific ways, that can seem a bit weird to people. And it can seem a bit like, oh, supernatural, or like, is that even real? Or, things like that. But when we're able to see very clearly how the principles we're working with in our practices are present all through nature, again, you can't really argue with that too much. You're like, oh yeah, I guess that's not so unreasonable for me to apply this same principle in a conscious way within what I do for myself. And yeah, so one, I guess it can help get past, objections or questions that people may have. Further than that, it also really helps to contribute to our understanding. It helps us to understand things much more clearly, that just by, focusing on the minute detail within ourselves, it might not be clear. But when we see the bigger picture, the bigger patterns, right, it's easier to understand. And we do this, as I mentioned, in all sorts of different ways within our Qigong practices. Part of it is doing things like copying animals. Different movements from them and so on, and then applying principles of those movements to ourselves. Now, you've got to be a little bit sensible about this. So just because, something else in nature does something doesn't mean that it applies in exactly the same way to us. I mean, shaking like a dog, we're not dogs, so it might not work in exactly the same way for us. But often there's things that carry over and we go like, this movement, moving like a bird, we see some of the characteristics of the bird. When we move in that way, it has a similar effect on us. So, not the same. We're not going to start flying, but we can draw principles and apply them. So that's one way, copying animals. And another way is copying other aspects of nature, and understanding their patterns. So at the moment, I am here by the beach. Beautiful sea behind me. The sun is just rising. Nice time to be here. And we recognize things like the pattern of, I'm going to turn the other way again actually when I talk about this, the pattern of the tides, the way they come in and out, and how we have similar patterns of energy ebbing and flowing within us. This is a natural pattern throughout nature, not just in the tides, but within us as well, and in many other places in nature too. The pattern of the rising and the setting of the sun, the dynamic interplay of yin and yang, and how this applies well right throughout many different aspects of nature and within ourselves as well. We also notice other patterns. So patterns like the way energy, so water carries energy a lot in nature. It carries heat. It carries food sources to different places. It carries, the moisture which causes vegetation to grow. It like water is just this amazing conductor, and so where water flows, energy tends to flow. And this principle applies within our bodies as well. And a lot of the flow of our energy within our body is very similar to the flows of water. And so when we're understanding that flow of energy in our body, we notice patterns like rivers. This is a cool little spot. There's actually a small, not much of a river, more of a stream, I suppose, but small river stream that flows down into the ocean. And so we notice these patterns in nature around us, and then we recognize, these same principles to a greater or lesser extent apply with what happens inside us as well. And when we understand how it occurs in nature, it actually helps us to understand in a much richer way what's going on inside us. We notice these patterns of rivers, of oceans, and so on. And there are practices that we use to work with this, to harmonize our energy flow, to help it flow more freely, and so on. Lots of other things, like, the trees. We learn lessons from the trees, the way the energy flows within them. We, again and again and again. And so, yeah, some of the more unusual, I suppose, aspects of Qigong, often we can understand better by understanding how those same principles occur in nature around us as well. Anyway, a little bit of a thought on that. I think, yeah, really understanding that connection between Qigong practices and the principles of nature all around us really helps us to understand them better, and can help us to get past any parts that we don't really understand maybe initially. It can help us to sort of, really grasp the principle when we see it occurring many, many different times all around us in nature. That's the vlog for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please like, comment, subscribe, share, all those good things. And I look forward to seeing you on the next one soon.